The Homeowners Association threatened to fine me thousands for my backyard workshop. Little did they know, I had a plan to turn their wrath into the community's salvation. What started as a war between myself and the HOA quickly escalated into a life-or-death struggle, pitting neighbor against neighbor in a desperate fight for the soul of our neighborhood. The sun was setting on another sweltering summer day as I stared out at my backyard workshop. For years, it had been my sanctuary, a place to tinker, create, and lose myself in my work. But now that sacred space was under siege. It all started last week when the HOA board showed up at my door, scowling and waving a thick stack of violation notices. Apparently, my modest workshop didn't meet their standards for neighborhood aesthetics. They wanted it gone, and they wanted it gone fast, threatening crippling fines if I didn't comply. This is unacceptable. I protested, my voice rising. I built this with my own 2 hands. It's not hurting anyone. The HOA president, a stern-faced woman named Clarissa, narrowed her eyes. The rules are the rules, Mr. Erickson. Either you bring that eyesore into compliance, or we'll have no choice but to levy the maximum penalties. The choice is yours. I watched, seething, as she and her cronies strutted back to their luxury SUVs, leaving me to stew in my own frustration. For years, I'd fought the HOA's petty tyranny, but this time, they'd gone too far. This was more than just my workshop. It was a symbol of my independence, my creativity, my very soul. That night, as I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, an idea began to form. It was crazy, reckless, and just might work. I jumped out of bed, pacing the floor as the plan crystallized in my mind. If the HOA wanted a fight, then a fight they would get. The next morning, I marched down to City Hall, determined to plead my case. The mayor, a kindly older man named Hank, listened intently as I laid out my proposal. "You want to do what?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "Turn my workshop into a temporary shelter for the homeless," I repeated, my voice steady. "The city's homeless population has been growing, and I know you've been struggling to find them adequate housing. Well, I have the perfect solution, right in my own backyard." Hank leaned back in his chair, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "It's certainly an unconventional idea, I'll give you that. But you really think the HOA will go for it?" I grinned, a gleam of mischief in my eye. "Oh, they'll go for it, all right. And when they do, I plan to make them regret ever threatening my workshop." With a resigned sigh, Hank nodded. "All right, Mr. Erickson. You've got my permission. Let's see what you can do." Little did the HOA know, they were about to be taught a lesson they'd never forget. The next day, I got to work transforming my humble backyard workshop into a temporary homeless shelter. I enlisted the help of a few friends and neighbors who had grown just as weary of the HOA's strong-arm tactics as I had. With hammer and nails, we got to work. We built sturdy bunk beds, installed basic amenities like running water and electricity, and filled the space with donated clothing, toiletries, and non-perishable food. It was no luxury hotel, but it was clean, safe, and far better than the streets. As the work progressed, word began to spread through the neighborhood. Some residents, like my friend Sarah, were quick to lend a hand. "This is incredible, John," she said, her eyes shining with pride as she helped sort through a donation of winter coats. "I can't believe you're doing this." Others, however, were less enthused. Clarissa and her cronies on the HOA board wasted no time in descending on my property, faces twisted with fury. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" Clarissa demanded, her manicured nails stabbing the air accusingly. I straightened, wiping the sweat from my brow. "What does it look like?" "I'm turning my workshop into a temporary homeless shelter, with the full support of the mayor. Your little fines and threats don't scare me anymore, Clarissa. This is bigger than your petty rules." Her lips pursed into a thin, angry line. "You can't just do this. It's completely against HOA regulations. This is unacceptable." I shrugged nonchalantly. The mayor disagrees, and frankly, I don't care what you or the HOA thinks anymore. These people need help, and I'm going to give it to them, whether you like it or not. Clarissa's face turned beet red, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. But then, unexpectedly, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Fine, she spat. But if this place causes any trouble, any at all, I'll make sure you regret the day you ever built it. With that, she and the other board members stormed off, muttering under their breath. I couldn't help but smile, knowing that I had finally gotten the upper hand. As the sun set that evening, the first group of residents arrived at my humble shelter. Their eyes were hollow, their faces etched with the hardships of life on the streets. But as they stepped through the door, a glimmer of hope seemed to ignite within them. I watched them settle in, taking in the simple comforts we had provided. For the first time in a long while, they looked safe. And in that moment, I knew that I had made the right decision, no matter what the HOA tried to do. This was just the beginning. The battle for the soul of our neighborhood was far from over. Over the next few days, word of my makeshift homeless shelter spread like wildfire through the community. People from all walks of life began to arrive, eager to lend a hand or donate supplies. The once quiet backyard was now a bustling hive of activity, with residents of all ages pitching in to make the space as comfortable and welcoming as possible. Despite Clarissa's ominous warning, the shelter quickly became a beacon of hope in our neighborhood. The formerly homeless residents seemed to blossom, their spirits lifted by the kindness and generosity of their new neighbors. They helped with chores, shared their stories, and even organized small community events to bring everyone together. As I watched this transformation unfold, I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. This was what I had envisioned, a place where the walls between us and them could be torn down, where empathy and understanding could flourish. And despite the HOA's continued resistance, the shelter only seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Of course, Clarissa and her cronies didn't take kindly to this. They showed up at my door again, faces twisted with anger and frustration. "This has gone on long enough, Erickson," Clarissa spat, her manicured nails stabbing the air. "Your little stunt is disrupting the entire neighborhood. The noise, the traffic, the riffraff you've brought in. It's unacceptable." I stood my ground, unflinching. "The mayor has given me his full support, Clarissa. As long as I'm operating within the law, there's nothing you can do to stop me." "We'll see about that," she hissed, eyes narrowing to slits. "Mark my words, Erickson, this isn't over. If you don't shut this place down, we'll find a way to make you regret it." With that, she and the other board members stormed off, muttering under their breath. I shook my head, a mixture of exasperation and determination washing over me. Later that evening, as I made my rounds through the shelter, checking in on the residents and ensuring everything was running smoothly, I couldn't shake the feeling that Clarissa was up to something. The HOA had always been a thorn in my side, but this time it felt different. More personal, more vindictive. "Hey, John," a familiar voice called out, snapping me from my thoughts. It was Sarah, her arms laden with boxes of donated clothing. "Everything okay? You look a little tense." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. Clarissa and the HOA were just here, threatening to shut this whole thing down. "I'm worried they're going to try something, Sarah. Something drastic." Sarah's brow furrowed, her expression shifting to one of concern. "Do you think we should call the police? Or maybe the mayor?" I shook my head. "No, not yet. I don't want to escalate things if I don't have to. But I'll be keeping a close eye on them, that's for sure." Sarah nodded, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Well, you know I've got your back, John. We all do. We're not going to let them take this away from us, or from the people who need it the most." I gave her a grateful smile, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Whatever Clarissa and the HOA had planned, I was ready for them. This shelter wasn't just mine. It belonged to the entire community now. and I'd be damned if I let anyone take that away. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between the HOA and the makeshift homeless shelter I had created in my backyard only seemed to intensify. Clarissa and her cohorts made regular appearances, their faces twisted with fury as they tried to find any way to shut down my operation. But the more they pushed, the more the community rallied behind me. Donations poured in, both in the form of supplies and volunteer help. Neighbors who had once been indifferent or even hostile to the idea of a homeless shelter in our midst now found themselves drawn to the sense of purpose and camaraderie that had blossomed within its walls. The residents, too, had transformed. Gone were the hollow, haunted looks on their faces, replaced by a newfound spark of hope and determination. They took pride in their roles, helping to maintain the shelter, organize group activities, and even advocate for themselves and their needs. One day, as I was making my rounds, I came across a small group of residents gathered in a tight circle, engaged in an animated discussion. I approached cautiously, not wanting to intrude, but one of the men, a grizzled, weathered soul named Greg, spotted me and waved me over. "Hey, John, come join us," he called out, a grin spreading across his weathered face. "We were just talking about how we can help fight back against the HOA. You know they're not going to give up without a fight, right?" I nodded, my brow furrowing with concern. "I know, Greg. They've been making my life hell ever since I opened this place. But I'm not going to let them shut us down without a fight either." "That's what I figured," Greg said, his eyes gleaming with a determined light. "And we want to help. We may be down on our luck, but we're not going to just roll over and let those pompous jerks win." The others in the group murmured their agreement, and I felt a surge of admiration and pride. These were people who had faced more hardship in their lives than most could even imagine. Yet they were still willing to stand up and fight. "All right then," I said, a grin spreading across my face. "What do you have in mind?" Over the next few hours, the group laid out a plan. A series of coordinated actions that would not only raise public awareness of the shelter's plight, but also put pressure on the HOA and city officials to back off. As I listened, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and gratitude. These were my friends, my partners in this endeavor, and they were willing to put it all on the line to protect what we had built together. Clarissa and the HOA had no idea what was coming, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I felt a surge of genuine optimism. We were in this fight together, and we were going to win. Over the next few days, the residents of the makeshift homeless shelter in my backyard sprang into action, executing the plan they had meticulously crafted. Their first move was to organize a peaceful protest, gathering outside City Hall with signs and banners that proclaimed the importance of their cause. "Save our shelter," they chanted, their voices carrying across the bustling plaza. Homes, not HOAs. The media quickly caught wind of the demonstration, and soon reporters were swarming the scene, eager to capture the story. Clarissa and the HOA board were forced to address the growing public outcry, but their attempts to discredit the shelter and its residents only seemed to backfire. "These people are just troublemakers, stirring up the community for their own selfish gain," Clarissa huffed in a televised interview, her perfectly coiffed hair belying the desperation in her eyes. But the residents were having none of it. One by one, they stepped forward to share their stories, tales of addiction, abuse, and hardship that had led them to the streets, and how the shelter had given them a glimmer of hope. "This place isn't just a roof over our heads," said Greg, his voice strong and unwavering. "It's a community, a family, and we're not going to let the HOA take that away from us without a fight." The public response was overwhelming. Donations poured in, both financial and in-kind, as the community rallied behind the cause. Even the mayor, who had initially been cautious in his support, now threw his full weight behind the shelter, condemning the HOA's attempts to shut it down. Clarissa and her cronies were left sputtering, their once formidable influence rapidly crumbling. They tried to rally their fellow HOA members, but many were now hesitant to align themselves with the increasingly unpopular board. "This isn't what we signed up for," one board member, a middle-aged woman named Deborah, told a local news outlet. "We're supposed to be maintaining property values and ensuring a pleasant neighborhood, not trying to kick out people who are down on their luck. Enough is enough." As the tide began to turn against them, the HOA board grew increasingly desperate. They launched a smear campaign, accusing the shelter of attracting crime and devaluing nearby properties. But the residents were quick to counter these claims, inviting the public to tour the clean, well-organized facility for themselves. The more the HOA fought, the more their credibility crumbled. And as the community's support for the shelter only seemed to grow, Clarissa and her fellow board members realized that they were fighting a losing battle. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but for the first time in years, the HOA had been outmaneuvered. And as I watched the residents celebrate their hard-won victory, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and accomplishment. This was just the beginning. The war was far from over, but for now, the shelter had emerged victorious. In the aftermath of the public showdown with the HOA, the shelter in my backyard experienced a surge of renewed energy and purpose. The residents, emboldened by their hard-won victory, threw themselves into the day-to-day operations with renewed vigor, taking on leadership roles and organizing even more community-building activities. Meanwhile, the HOA board, led by the increasingly desperate Clarissa, was reeling. They had tried every trick in the book to shut down the shelter, but the community's overwhelming support for the cause had left them floundering. Realizing that their usual tactics of threats and intimidation were no longer working, they began to grow increasingly unhinged in their efforts to regain control. One fateful evening, as I was making my rounds through the shelter, a commotion erupted outside. Rushing to the scene, I found Clarissa and a small group of her supporters wielding sledgehammers and crowbars, attempting to demolish the makeshift structures we had built. "This ends today, Erickson," Clarissa screamed, her face contorted with rage. "We're putting a stop to this madness, once and for all." The residents, sensing the danger, quickly sprang into action, forming a human barrier to protect their home. Tempers flared, and before long, a full-blown confrontation was underway, with both sides shouting and shoving. In the chaos, I caught sight of Sarah, her eyes wide with fear as she tried to de-escalate the situation. Rushing to her side, I grabbed her arm, pulling her to safety. "We need to call the police," I yelled over the din. "This has gone too far." Sarah nodded, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. But before she could dial, a deafening crash echoed through the backyard. One of Clarissa's cronies had managed to break through the human barrier, swinging his crowbar with reckless abandon. The residents scattered, screaming in terror, as the man advanced, his eyes wild with fury. I watched in horror, frozen in place, as he raised the crowbar, preparing to bring it down on the nearest person. But before he could strike, a sudden blur of motion caught my eye. Greg, the grizzled resident I had come to admire, had thrown himself in front of the attacker, shielding the others with his own body. The crowbar came down with a sickening thud, and Greg crumpled to the ground, motionless. Time seemed to stand still as we all stared, stunned, at the scene unfolding before us. Clarissa's eyes widened, the color draining from her face as the gravity of what had happened settled in. In that moment, the war between the HOA and the shelter had taken a dark, irreversible turn, and I knew, with a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, that nothing would ever be the same again. The aftermath of the violent confrontation between the HOA and the residents of the shelter was a haze of chaos and sorrow. As Greg lay motionless on the ground, the rest of us stood frozen, unsure of how to react. Thankfully, the sound of sirens in the distance snapped us out of our stupor, and within minutes, the backyard was swarming with police officers and emergency responders. Clarissa and her supporters were quickly apprehended, their faces etched with a mix of shock and growing dread. Meanwhile, the paramedics tended to Greg, their expressions grim as they worked to stabilize his condition. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest, as they carefully loaded him into the ambulance and sped away, the wail of the siren fading into the distance. In the aftermath, the community was shaken to its core. News of the incident spread like wildfire, sparking outrage and calls for accountability. The mayor, who had previously been a vocal supporter of the shelter, now found himself under intense scrutiny, with residents demanding to know how such a violent confrontation could have been allowed to occur. For me, the pain and guilt were almost too much to bear. I had fought so hard to create a haven for those in need, only to have it all come crashing down in the most tragic of ways. As I stood amidst the debris and chaos, I felt a deep sense of failure, a weight that threatened to crush me. But the residents, battered and bruised as they were, refused to be broken. In the days that followed, they rallied together, organizing vigils and fundraisers to support Greg and his family. The community, once divided, now stood united in their grief and determination to see justice served. Even Clarissa and the HOA board, once the formidable antagonists, found themselves on the defensive. Public opinion had turned against them, and they were now the ones facing intense scrutiny and condemnation. As the investigation into the incident progressed, it became clear that the HOA's repeated attempts to shut down the shelter had played a significant role in escalating the tensions. Their aggressive tactics, combined with the residents' unwillingness to back down, had created a powder keg that had ultimately exploded in the most tragic of ways. For me, the realization that my efforts to help the homeless had led to such a devastating outcome was almost too much to bear. I found myself questioning everything, wondering if I had made the right decision in the first place. But as I watched the community come together, supporting one another and rallying around the cause, I knew that I couldn't give up. The fight for the shelter's future was far from over, and I was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. In the weeks that followed the violent confrontation between the HOA and the residents of the shelter, the community was left reeling. Greg, the brave resident who had shielded his fellow neighbors from the attacker's crowbar, remained in critical condition at the hospital, his survival hanging by a thread. The public outcry over the incident was deafening, with calls for immediate action and accountability ringing out across the city. The mayor, who had initially been a vocal supporter of the shelter, now found himself caught in the crosshairs, accused of failing to protect the vulnerable residents and allowing the situation to escalate to such a dangerous level. Clarissa and the HOA board, meanwhile, were the targets of intense public scrutiny. Their repeated attempts to shut down the shelter and the aggressive tactics they had employed were now seen as the primary catalysts for the violence that had erupted. Facing a barrage of lawsuits and criminal investigations, the once powerful group found their influence rapidly crumbling. As the legal proceedings unfolded, I found myself at the center of the storm, called upon to testify and provide detailed accounts of the events leading up to the confrontation. It was a harrowing experience, reliving the trauma and grappling with the weight of the consequences. But through it all, the residents of the shelter remained steadfast in their determination to keep the community alive. They continued to rally support, organizing vigils and fundraisers to support Greg and his family. The once divisive issue had become a unifying force, with the entire neighborhood coming together to fight for the cause. And then, one day, a glimmer of hope emerged. Greg, against all odds, began to show signs of improvement, his condition stabilizing as he fought for his life. The news spread like wildfire, reigniting the community's spirits and renewing their resolve to see this battle through to the end. As the trial against the HOA board progressed, the evidence mounted, and it became increasingly clear that their actions had directly contributed to the violence that had unfolded. Clarissa and her cohorts found themselves facing not only civil lawsuits, but also the very real possibility of criminal charges. In the end, justice prevailed. The HOA board was held accountable for their role in the incident, and the shelter was granted permanent status, with the city pledging to provide ongoing support and resources to ensure its continued operation. As for Greg, he made a remarkable recovery, eventually returning to the shelter and taking on a leadership role in the community he had so bravely defended. The scars, both physical and emotional, would never fully heal, but the sense of triumph and unity that had emerged from the ordeal was palpable. In the aftermath, the shelter continued to thrive, becoming a beacon of hope and resilience in the community. And as I looked out over the bustling backyard, filled with the laughter and camaraderie of those who had once been cast aside, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of pride and gratitude. The war had been won, but the real victory lay in the transformation of a once divided community into a true family, bound by the shared experience of struggle, triumph, and the unbreakable human spirit.